Hey guys, I'm back. Mystery of my audio has possibly been solved. I'm not sure. I don't want to get into the technical stuff, but instead of using my CD player to have musical accompaniment in the background going through my mixer, it wasn't working. I'm actually sticking my CDs into my DVD player, and for some reason that audio pipes through to the mixer. I don't know about the mixture. I know the first time I did record this, the music tended to be too loud, and I have orchestral music on, Halloween orchestral music in the background. And because it's classical music, the volume jumps all over the place, so it may be too low at times and it may be too loud at other times. But I'm not doing a 60-minute video here anyway. I was a little unsure whether I should do this video or not. An additional second Halloween video. I really showed most of my Halloween stuff last time around, that stuff that I pull out and I play every year at Halloween time, and that's audio books as well as music. I left out a few that I couldn't find. I thought I would show them, though. I'm going to show you what a nerd I really am, I guess, and show you mostly book stuff. So I'll show the music first, and you could skip the rest if you want. I talked about these, but I couldn't find them. Actually, the one I'm playing, which is another classical compilation called Witch's Brew, but this is excellent. This is the season for me. Another version of Dance Macabre, a lot of the same tracks that are on many classical compilations. I fell in love with that cover, and I probably would have bought it based on the cover if it was, Oktoberfest German beer drinking Oompa music, just based on the cover. But thankfully, it's a really nice classical collection with some odd choices. Holst the planets as Uranus instead of Mars. Most of these classical compilations stick the Mars, the Bringer of War track from Holst the Planets on there, because that's a pretty dark track. But this one actually chooses Uranus the Magician instead. It's got the Sorcerer's Apprentice, Grieg Peace, I can't speak today, Lyric Suite, a Debussy piece, which is, wow, I really can't talk. Debussy piece, which is unusual because Debussy is not known for kind of dark stuff. It's only a 3-minute piece. Mendelssohn piece, Burlette's Symphonie Fantastique, Dream of a Witch's Sabbath, and Two Russian Witches, which is a piece that two pieces of music, which appear on a couple compilations of classical music by, I don't know how you pronounce the composer's name, and I can't even read it, Liadov, Liadov. Not one you see a lot of. I actually have several versions of that Two Russian Witches piece, which is kind of cool. Mussorgsky, Night in Bear Mountain, Dance Macabre again. It's really great. This is out of print, but, I show it only because the way these things come and go out of print, and just because they're out of print doesn't mean there's not copies around. Two things that have nothing to do with Halloween that in my mind are Halloween recordings now. I talked about Tangerine Dream's Green Desert, which, usually the imagery of a desert would implicate to me heat and hot and summertime, and nothing to do with October or Halloween. Music is especially the first 5 minutes, is basically a low bass drone note that kind of has an evil sound to it, is part of it, part of the reason. But that I associate this with Halloween. But there was a Halloween about 10 years or so ago that I had this sitting on the shelf, and it was the first time the album really hit home to me. And I was playing it like every night, and it turned out to be Halloween season. Wouldn't you know? In my mind, all of a sudden the Halloween connection was made, and so that always gets pulled out and played. And another one, we talk about this a lot, and Carm just had this on his book channel, showing this. Another thing that has nothing to do with Halloween, Manuel Gottsching, very nice German gentleman, guitar player, synthesizer player, still around, still making music. Proud. He's actually a friend of mine on Facebook. Lovely guy. And here's a Dreams and Desire album of his that was released in the early 90s, but it was actually recorded in 77, but didn't get released until 91. There's a piece on 23-minute piece or so called Desire, and it's got that ghost sound that I've mentioned in the past. It's got this ghostly woo sound that goes throughout the whole track that I always picture a ghost flying around the backyard of where I used to live when I hear that. I purposely left this out of the last video, and then I was talking to Carm about it. Because Carm kind of said, you showed all these, audio books and things like that you associate with the season, and I was kind of thinking of UFO Crash at Roswell. How come you didn't show that? And the reason I didn't show it, and I've decided to now, is because I do always listen to this Halloween, but because it's Roswell, New Mexico, and I hope the music's not too loud. Because it's Roswell, again, I have that thing with the heat and the desert and the hot and summertime, and because I always play this in summertime too. This is an actual documentary. It's just an audio documentary. It could easily be a movie, a film, documentary about the UFO crash at Roswell, and tape recordings of individuals who were around at the time and things they saw and observed. But it does always get played because of the subject matter at Halloween. So you know what? I pulled it out to show it. That's it for the music. So if you only have interest in music, you can all go now. And like I said, I'm playing that Witch's Brew thingy. Compilation of great classical music. I hope the sound is okay. I really didn't do a test. I'm going to show some books to show you what a nerd I am. When I was a kid, I loved comic books. And specifically as I got older, kind of horror comic books. And in recent years, these things have been reprinted. So I'm going to show a couple of my favorites that I had when I was a kid. And they all work for this time of year. The first is, this is a whole series. You can see The House of Mystery was a regular DC comic book. You can see how thick this thing is. DC Comics, which is the comic company that puts out Green Arrow and Superman and Batman and all those guys, had this anthology, actually many titles for a while. But the two best-known ones were called The House of Mystery and The House of Secrets, and they were two comic books I loved when I kind of started getting out of the superhero phase, and I was heavily into horror movies. You can see how thick these things are. These were regular color comic books, and when I found out that they were reprinting these, there's many volumes of these, by the way. I have maybe 3 volumes of each one. Each volume has about 20 to 21 issues in there. They're thick. They're very inexpensive. Well, in the U.S. it's about $18, but there's 22 issues in here. The only thing that I don't like, I would rather have them charge more, is that these were all color comic books. Everything was reproduced in black and white here, which really kept the cost down. But I would much rather have them in color. But it's nice being able to relive my youth because, in the end, I didn't end up keeping any of these old comics, So I have maybe 3 volumes of each one of these, and they go on. There's many more. But that really brings out the kid in me, and this time of year, sometimes the other time of year, I even recall that I have them, and I start to pull them out to read them. DC Comics had many other anthology series. I haven't repurchased those, and they weren't as... those two, The House of Secrets and House of Mystery, had a really long run, years and years and years. They had other anthology series when horror got real popular in the late 60s, early 70s that didn't last as long. I'm not sure if they have reproduced those in that format yet. I think they have. I just don't have those. When I got a little bit older, I discovered horror comic magazines that weren't comic books, and they were black and white magazines. And those too, in recent years, have been reproduced. and I think they're doing the full run of all the issues of these. They were comics, but they were magazines, so there was a lot of bloodshed, and there's actually nude women in them and things like that. Now, drawn, mind you, animated, or drawn, yeah, but and Eerie always had great, Eerie and Creepy and Vampirella were these comic book magazines that didn't have to get approved by the Comics Code Authority, so there was a lot of bloodshed. And these were strictly black and white horror anthologies. Lots of good artists, lots of artists I had never heard of before, lots of Spanish artists that they used. And there's many volumes of these are really expensive. Each one of these usually collects about 5 issues of the magazine in hardcover form. And they are in black and white because that's the way they originally came. But the list price for these are $50 each, very expensive. And right now, and I probably have the first 5 or 6 of both Eerie and Creepy, which were essentially the same thing, just different hosts. They always had great covers. Oh, they pretty much always had these painted covers for the magazines that drew you in. And when they chose the covers for the hardcovers, they just chose one of the 5 issues that they reproduced. The cover, one of the favorite covers from the 5 or so issues that they reproduced in here. But I have maybe 5 of each one, the first 5 volumes. Like I said, they're $50 each. They're really expensive. Hosted by Cousin Eerie and Uncle Creepy. Black and white, like I said. They're kind of like, they do a good job. They're hardcover. The pages are glossy, but that's kind of expensive. And when you consider the number of volumes, there's, 25, 50, that's more than 25, probably 50 volumes of some of these. That's a lot of money. But they're great to relive my nerdy youth, and I love those things. And, they're in the closet, and so I tend to forget about them and then always recall them at this time of year. Especially when stuff like Creepshow comes on TV, which is kind of based on horror comics. I don't read a whole lot of fiction, and I don't know how initially I got hooked on this series a number, years ago, early 2000s, and you probably heard of the Ring movies that were based on novels by Koji Suzuki, and thankfully if you saw any of the movies, reading the books, I guess this is always the case. If you see a movie and then you read a book, when a scene that you recall from the movie from the book is reproduced in the movie, you tend to picture in your mind the scene from the movie when you're reading the book. I think I saw the first one in Japanese, not there's American versions, which I didn't see until much later. The original Japanese versions in Japanese, they weren't dubbed into English or anything, were much better. Lower budget than the American version. But, and boy, I tell you, I don't read fiction very much. But these, the Ring cycle, it was 3 books. There was Ring, the first one, which is a story about basically a haunted, it's a curse that is carried from somebody viewing a haunted videotape. That this spirit has created this haunted videotape. And the catch is you'll die if you don't show the videotape to like 2 other people or somebody else, and you have to keep spreading it, and if you don't show it to somebody else within 72 hours or whatever it is, you die. So it multiplies. If you want to live, you got to go show this videotape to other people, and then they have to show it to other people. And the second book is very much in a detective called Spiral, which is really good. Actually, the first one is good if you know the basic story. It's nice, but I really got hooked starting with the second one, which is almost more like a detective story. And the sequel that they made in America didn't follow the books at all, only the first one, and then they just did a rehash of the first one. In Japan, they did faithfully do a sequel that didn't do too well, but it followed the book to the T, which was beautiful. Oddly enough, because the movie didn't do well, they ended up doing, just reimagining the whole thing and doing another sequel to the first movie, pretending that the second movie was never made, which is ridiculous. which means that they never actually filmed the story that's in the third book called Loop, which is incredible because when you get to the end of the second one, the world has basically ended, and you're like, because of this curse, the curse has infected everybody, and you're like, well, what the hell else is left? How could you write another story? And the whole first half of Loop basically goes over the history of the first two books. But I still say you can't skip the first two books because it kind of coldly just tells you what happened in the first book, but you're not experiencing it like through the character's eyes, like you do when you actually read the first two books. So that if you were to just read the third book, the first half of it is basically just going over the facts, and it's like, it's not playing out. It's more like a statement of facts, and then it finally gets to the story of, well, if the world ended, how can there be any more story? And it's just real clever how this is all explained. I've got a few more. I went on a number of years ago now, probably about 10 years ago. For about 6 months, I went on a cooking kick. When I had my old job at an office building, and I had a decent 40-hour-a-week job. Briefly, I got into cooking, and because Halloween is my favorite time of year, I ended up buying a couple. Well, this is the only one that I could find. Halloween treats. I don't know. I think I made maybe one of these. I don't eat this kind of stuff. I got a weight problem, and so I don't eat cookies and cakes and things like that. But I did make a pumpkin cake one year, and I still would like to do these eventually. I'll find somebody to give the things to. I love the spiderweb cookies. How cool is that? And these are pretty easy for even idiots like me to make. So I will hold on to this, and I'm probably not going to end up cooking this year either. But I'll hold on to it, and I will make them eventually. And a couple more books. Here's a hardcover. Very rare to find these in hardcover. Alfred Hitchcock stories. What this is, I bought this at Barnes & Noble on a clearance table for $10. Pretty thick book. Lots of stories in here. These are not horror. These are straight mystery stories. But I should explain that many years ago, in the early 80s, I got into this kick. And most of these, there's always been a ton of inexpensive paperback books, and they're fairly thin. There's not a lot of stories in them, of by quote-unquote Alfred Hitchcock stories. Now, Hitchcock didn't write any of them. And what all these books were, and I had, I don't know, about 30 of them, they were nothing but, if you remember the Alfred Hitchcock Presents television show that was on in the 50s, that got so popular that an Alfred Hitchcock mystery magazine was created. It was a monthly magazine, and believe it or not, the monthly magazine still goes to this day. And that's tough because in the 50s, magazines were big because, I mean, a lot of people still didn't even have television, but even so, you didn't have the internet, you didn't have videotapes or DVDs and things like that. So, you had whatever was on in television, whatever was on the radio. Couldn't time shift, didn't have a DVR to watch it if you were at work when your favorite show was on. So I think that's the reason why there was still a lot of story fiction magazines and true romance and this kind of thing that flourished still through the 50s. And all those magazines, and most magazines, are pretty much gone now. Oddly enough, Alfred Hitchcock Mystery Magazine still exists. I think it's down to 4 or 6 times a year now, I'm not sure. But through the years, it's published many stories, and what they decided to do is, instead of just letting these stories die out, and they're short stories, 6 or 8 pages, what they would do is they started compiling, just cherry-picking various stories and putting them into inexpensive paperback books. So the stories had a second life, and they weren't pulled down off the shelf after a month. And I know that the paperback started coming out probably in the 60s, I want to say. And at that time, they had mostly stories written in the 50s. Those same paperback books, I remember seeing old original copies in the bookstore. Those original compilations from the Alfred Hitchcock Presents Mystery Magazine thing again, so my voice is probably going to get real funky. So those paperback books
came out. They were out for a number of years. They went out of print, and then they went back in print again a number of years later, so they really got their money's worth out of them. And they were always, meant to be inexpensive little compilations, and I never knew them to compile, various stories from over the years from the Alfred Hitchcock Mystery Magazine into a hardcover until I found this. So there may be more than just this one. But it's Alfred Hitchcock Tales of Terror. There's no horror in it, but still it's something that I always think of this time of year, and I'll pull out and I'll try to get through some stories. It's very thick. A lot of stories in here. And the stories range from the year 1959 all the way to 1976. So I really like the older ones. They're very quaint. You could a lot of times tell that they were written in the late 50s, early 60s by the way the characters speak and the way it's written and everything. But this goes up to quote unquote modern time, 76, which I tend to think of as being more modern, but a lot of people that are watching this weren't even born then. But it's fun. I do prefer the 50s stories. 59 it starts in. There's some stories from the early 60s, late 60s, and like I said, up to 76, 58 stories in here. It's just a fun Halloween kind of read. More mystery and crime stuff than horror, really. But it's just one of those things to read when you want to read something that the stories are like 8 pages long or something quite short. Last one I have is this is a perfect book for Halloween. I don't know how I discovered this, and it went out of print for a while, and I just looked and I saw that there's copies again available. A thing called Harvest Tales and Midnight Reveals. Very much a Halloween book. Very interesting. The story background of the book is almost as interesting as the stories in here. Again, it's all short stories. These are more horror type stories, very much in the Halloween mode. And what this was is the people that compiled the book and got the whole idea for the book to put it together were a couple of people that really loved Halloween. And every year, I think this started during their college years, they would have a big Halloween party and people would come over and everybody had to bring something to eat or something like that. But everybody that came had to tell a story, an original story. As short as they want, it could be a poem, it could be a short story, whatever. And this went on for years. As a matter of fact, it may still be going on with these folks. And so everybody had to come with a story or a poem that had to do with Halloween or the season or kind of horrific, scary stuff. And what they did is after years and years of doing this, they actually chose what some of their favorite stories were over the years, and got the permission from the people that created the stories to put a book together. So this book looks like it initially came out in 1998. And so there are a lot of short stories. These are definitely horror stories. Some very short. Definitely more in the adult mode. Not kids, not stuff for kids. Nice little drawings and things like that that go with them. There's the occasional illustration in there pertaining to that particular story. I stick so many things in these books, and then of course they fall out. I haven't read all of these either, but I don't think I've ever read this when it wasn't the Halloween season, or immediately after, mid-November. And oddly enough, I don't remember any of the stories that I did read. So even going back and reading it again is fun. So there's a few poems in here, and most of these are short stories. I love the concept though. The idea that they had a lot of stories to choose from when they compiled this book, because they had been throwing these parties for years. So they really kind of just went with the best, the ones that they thought were the best. Got the people that created the stories to write them and got their permission to print them. And it's a fun book. It's perfect for this time of year. That's what it's made for. And it did go out of print for a bunch of years, and now it looks like when I look tonight that it's in print again. So I didn't mean to go this long. That's a fun one. And like I said, I don't read a lot of
fiction stuff. I really don't. And that's pretty much, a lot of all that I have in terms of fiction stuff, if you count the comic book stuff. Okay, didn't mean to go this long. I love Halloween. It looks like I'm going to be back at work pretty quick in the next day or two, forever, how long I can stand to take it, until I'm looking for something else. And so thanks for watching, guys. Hope you're digging Halloween time as much as I do, or I am. And I'll talk to you soon.